So now let's review homework exercise 11. And I should say about this exercise that this is the closest you will get to a preview of your next quiz. This is an exercise that takes the commonplace argument forms and all of the fallacies and mixes them up together in a series of multiple choice questions. And so we're not working just within one category of interpretation, but you may find arguments or fallacies related to the category of being, the category of cause, or the category of similarity. So maybe the best thing to do to start is, as you look at each of the items, try to determine the category that you're working in, and that may help you to narrow down which of the possible answers could be the correct one. So number one, since Congress has passed an appropriation that will supplement the pay of those called away from their jobs to serve in the National Guard, it is only fair that Guard members called to active duty by the state of New Hampshire should have equal access to supplemental pay, since their mission is no less vital. If you're looking at this, you probably noticed the common phrase, "it's only fair," also a reference here to equal access. And that tells you that this is a comparison, and not just a comparison, but a reciprocity argument. That appeal to fairness or justice is the clue for the reciprocity argument from the similarity category. Number two, it is true that from a law and order perspective, the riots and looting that followed the death of George Floyd seem unnecessarily destructive and counterproductive. However, when considered in the context of the history of American racism, the violence by some protesters is a justifiable expression of righteous anger. And so the key here, as you're looking at this, keep this in mind, you have a comparison of perspectives, right? We're trying to determine how to give meaning to the particular actions that we're studying. We look at one perspective, then we look at it from another perspective, and that second perspective seems to be privileged. That gives us our answer about how to define the rioting, the looting, the protesting, and this contrast of perspectives we call the dissociation argument. Number three, so far she's enjoyed all 6 of the Jane Austen novels she has read. I'm sure then that she will enjoy Austen's most famous novel, Pride and Prejudice. So we have 6 known cases, and we're moving to a claim about a 7th case. It's not in a typical form, but this is a generalization argument. Normally, you might have a larger sample, but of course, Jane Austen only wrote 7 novels, so we can't have a larger sample. But we move from the known results of reading 6 of them and suggest or claim that that same response will be true for the last of the 7 novels. That's a generalization argument. Number 4. The 700 test subjects born between 1940 and 1970 all still possessed some immunity to smallpox from the vaccinations they had received when they were children. It is clear, then, that should there be a biological attack with that virus, that many Americans born before 1970 will have a degree of protection from that deadly disease and could survive. So in this case, we have a group of test subjects, what we might call a sample, people born between 1940 and 1970. And what is discovered among them is a causal connection between vaccination and immunity to smallpox. Now, then we move to say everybody in that age group, that is everybody born between 1940 and 1970, not just those in the sample, but everybody in that age group, must also have that same immunity if they had been vaccinated. So we have, in other words, a projected property that was found in the sample and which is then believed to be true of the general population of people in that age group. And so we have what we call a causal generalization. The causal argument is, or the causal claim is the connection between the vaccination and the immunity. And the generalization is the claim that everybody in that age group, every American born before 1970, would have a degree of protection. Number 5, hundreds of employees were laid off. The company could not pay its creditors. The business lost its bond rating, and the CEO has disappeared. It is apparent that the company has failed. So as you look at this argument, you see we have a speculative conclusion. It's apparent that the company has failed. We don't know that for certain, but it's based on what kind of evidence? It's based on evidence of observing a number of different phenomena. Employees being laid off, company can't pay its creditors, business lost its bond rating, CEO disappearing. These are all, in effect, signs of a business failing. It doesn't mean absolutely or for certain that the business has failed. It's not what we would call an infallible sign, but it's a very good probability that all of these things are signs that the business has failed. Thus, we have the coexistential argument, or what we could call the argument from sign. Number 6. I'm tired of all these snot-nosed Ivy League civil libertarians whining about airport searches and suspect detentions while they sip their Chardonnay at postmodern gallery openings and remind their comrades about how tolerant they are of other cultures. What about our culture? What about traditional American patriotism? If you ask me, we ought to bring back the Sedition Act, arrest some of these elitist know-it-alls, and put them to work cleaning latrines in Baghdad. So here we have an argument that seems rather passionate, and that's part of the clue here. We're meant to respond with emotion, and we're meant to respond in a way that allows the language here to substitute for evidence. And so we have an emotive language fallacy in this particular instance. The language obviously is meant to be strong and passionate, and that is meant to carry the persuasion or the convincingness beyond perhaps what any evidence would permit. Number 7. The university said the final exam was canceled because of the weather. Sure, it was snowing, but consider that the professor was unavailable the day before, that he speaks a foreign language, that he has a beard, and that he's known to have religious documents in his office. It appears the weather excuse was just a smokescreen. I think the professor was arrested under the Patriot Act as a potential terrorist. Well, we look at this and we could say, sure, it's possible that the professor was in fact a potential terrorist. That may have been the reason why he was arrested. But we could ask also, is there a better explanation? And of course, if we think about that, the better explanation would be the simpler explanation or the more frequent explanation. That is to say, a simpler explanation would be simply, yes, the exam was canceled because of the snowstorm. If there in fact was a snowstorm going on, as it says here, right? That's a much better explanation for why the exam was canceled. And so we have an instance here where that explanation fails common sense test for a hypothesis. It is then a far-fetched hypothesis. Number 8. The General Education Committee justified the new requirement in the area of social identity and cultural awareness by pointing out that, quote, many other universities are adding such requirements, and that such requirements are, quote, consistent with trends in higher education and are part of, quote, a new wave of general education revisions. That's enough for me. Sounds like this new requirement is the right thing to do. So here we have a claim that supports the institution of a social identity and cultural awareness general education requirement. But notice the evidence here. All of the evidence has to do with how popular such requirements are at other universities, that it's trendy, that it's a new wave, that other universities are doing it, so we should too, right? And so that's the version of the ad populum fallacy. It's the one that your mother always told you about. If all your friends jumped off a bridge, would you jump off a bridge too, right? The ad populum fallacy. Number 9. Here's another reference to the General Education Committee. The General Education Committee also concluded that in the same requirement, the categories of social identity would be defined as race, gender, and sexual orientation. In the view of the committee, the categories were defined this way because they are important for students to study, and they are important for students to study because they are the major social categories by which we define who we are and how we relate to one another. Well, if you look at this here, we get a version of begging the question. It's actually a circular argument because the conclusion here is simply a restatement of the premise. The premise is assumed to be true. That supports the conclusion, which is really no more than a restatement of the argument statement. So we have a circular argument or variation on begging the question. Number 10. For more than 30 years, Professor Farrell has been using items on his argument tests that refer to Leinenkugel's beer. Sure, he can't buy it anymore since moving from Wisconsin, but he has always used Leinenkugel's questions, and students now expect them. He shouldn't switch to Red Hook or Smutty Nose questions just because he lives in New Hampshire. And perhaps you recognize here, he's always been doing it, right, as the main reason, and that's the appeal to tradition fallacy, right? By the way, you can get Leinenkugels in New Hampshire, just not the standard regular Leinenkugels. It's always mostly the Shandy or some of the other fancier varieties of Leinenkugels. But the regular Leinenkugels is not available still in New Hampshire. But I will continue to use Leinenkugels examples on my quizzes and homework exercises. Number 11. She hadn't done well on any of the previous argument exams, but she switched to drinking the new Extreme Holiday Buzz coffee sold at the Ramones coffee truck. Since then, her all-night study sessions have really paid off, and she zipped through the last exam with great success. Now she's recommending that coffee to her friends who have tests. So we have a kind of causal generalization here in the sense that we have a causal claim, drinking Extreme Holiday Buzz coffee improved test scores, and then we have the generalization which says she's recommending the coffee to her friends who have tests, but then we have to ask whether the causal claim is warranted or not. And in fact, if we investigate it, if we apply those questions about sufficiency and necessity, or if we ask, are there negative cause cases and negative effects cases, we end up with what we find is the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, because it is unlikely that she did better on the exam because she drank a particular variety of coffee available at Ramones. In this instance, there would be obviously a number of negative cause cases, that is to say, people who did well on the exam who didn't drink the coffee, and there would be a number of negative effects cases, that is, people who drank the coffee who still didn't do well on the exam. And so that causal claim would be less credible or unwarranted, and that's the reason we find the post hoc fallacy. Number 12. The university president has expelled 6 students. It follows that those students were found guilty of inciting the Red Sox riot. This is a question from an old quiz, refers back to the days when after the Red Sox lost to the Yankees in the playoffs in 2003, UNH students rioted in downtown Durham, including burning a couch in the middle of Main Street and doing some other rather irresponsible things. So in this case, we have a good clue here. We have the phrase, it follows that, and that tells us that the second statement is the claim of the argument, and it also suggests that we are engaged in deductive reasoning. That is, it tells us that this argument is at least imitating or mimicking syllogistic form. It is then a version of a transitivity argument or a quasi-logical argument that works like a syllogism. That is, we figure out what's going on in the claim statement because we understand the relationship of the categories, subject terms and predicate terms that are referred to in that and in the previous statement. So we actually have three different categories. We have students, we have people who were found guilty of inciting the riot, and we have people who were expelled. And we know that the president expelled 6 of the students, and there's a missing premise here that we fill in, right? But what we know or what we add into the argument in our reasoning is that everybody who was expelled was guilty of rioting. So transitivity argument. Number 13. Sorry. The hockey player complained that the sanctions imposed by the coach were unfair, but we should not credit the opinions of a player who violated the rules and participated in encouraging a riot. So in this case, don't be thrown by the unfair word here. This is not a reciprocity argument, because notice that the player isn't compared to somebody else in an equal or same position, but rather, look here, we should not credit the opinions of a player who violated the rules and participated in encouraging a riot. That is, we dismiss the position taken by the player not because of what the player says, but because of his character or past history. It's an example of an ad hominem fallacy. Okay? Number 14. The university has affirmed the value of diversity in the student body and faculty and seeks to attract applicants from all races and ethnic backgrounds. It is imperative, therefore, that we add a diversity course to the general education program and require students to study a diversity of alternative lifestyles, oppressed groups, and non-Western religions. So in this case, there's obviously a key term here, that is diversity, right? Diversity here, and diversity here. But as we look at the term, it has a shifting meaning as the argument unfolds, right? So up here, with diversity in the student body and faculty means a student body and faculty that includes people from a variety of racial and ethnic backgrounds. That's quite a bit different thing than a diversity course, which teaches a particular kind of academic subject, right? And also diversity meaning just different in this sense of requiring students to study a diversity of alternative lifestyles, oppressed groups, and non-Western religions. But because of the shifting meaning of that term, because the term is unstable, we don't know for sure what the term means when we get to the claim, and that's an example of the equivocation fallacy. Number 15. Sometimes adversity brings out the best in people. Take as a case in point the family that lost all their belongings in the California fire and still showed up to do volunteer work at the local family homeless shelter. So the clue here, as you're looking at this, right, is the phrase take as a case in point. When you have a claim, in this case, sometimes adversity brings out the best in people, and that claim is proven, or that is the evidence that's given, is a particular instance or example. We have an argument by example. Okay. Number 16. The cause of the recent economic decline in the state is clear. The much publicized toll booth experiment was a failure and produced less revenue than planned. So in this instance, we know we have a causal argument because we're making a claim about the cause of the recent economic decline in the state. And we have an explanation that's offered, a causal explanation, right? The much publicized toll booth experiment was a failure that produced less revenue than planned. But in this instance, obviously, the alleged cause, that is the toll booth experiment failing, is insufficient to account for the economic decline in the state, whether that's the economic decline during the COVID-19 pandemic or even the economic decline in ordinary times. It's too simple an explanation, so it's a false cause fallacy. Even a better answer, though it's not appeared here, would be the single cause fallacy, because even though the toll booth experiment failure might have contributed to some part of the economic decline in the state, it is very unlikely that it is sufficient to produce a major economic decline statewide. So we could even change this here to single cause fallacy, which is a better answer. Number 17. There is no specific plan for allowing certain engineering majors to count the general education requirement as one of their major courses. Therefore, despite its overall value to the curriculum, the proposal to add an environmental literacy requirement to the general education program should be rejected. And in this case, there's a clue here. We have the person arguing. This is the claim because of the word therefore. And in the claim, the person says, despite its overall value to the curriculum. That is a recognition that the plan, for the most part, is beneficial or advantageous. But the person is still recommending the plan should be rejected. So we go looking for the reason for that. And the reason is stated in the first statement, right? It does not allow engineering majors to count the general education requirement as one of their major courses. And that might be important to a few engineering majors, but it's obviously just one small facet or element of the overall plan. It shouldn't be the basis for rejecting the whole thing, but to do it on that basis makes it a straw argument, right? Where you take in this case, you give exaggerated importance to some negative aspect of something you want to reject. Number 18. She ordered her holiday gifts from the catalog of the internet company that runs those television infomercials after the telemarketer who had sent her 15 spam emails called her at home during dinner. That type of advertising is unethical and should be banned. So in this case, we have a claim in the second statement that type of advertisement is unethical and should be banned. And that claim about banning advertising is based on the evidence given in the first statement. But if we look closely at that evidence, it is really hard to tell what the referent for the pronoun that is. That is to say, when we talk about that type of advertising, which type of advertising are we in fact talking about? And it's not clear at all from the evidence statement, because in that evidence statement, we have a reference to catalogs, to an internet company, to television infomercials, to telemarketers, to spam emails, and to phone calls at home. So which type of advertising does the arguer think is unethical and should be banned? It's unclear. That is, it's ambiguous. And so we have here an example of amphiboly, that is a fallacy based on a grammatical ambiguity in the argument. Number 19. The courts have recently upheld the right of the police to run sobriety checkpoints. From this case will follow erosion of all our constitutional protections. Soon the courts will allow home searches without warrants, and then citizens will be detained without charge or trial. Before you know it, speaking out against these usurpations will be considered a crime against the state, punishable by death in a military tribunal. This obviously is the downfall of American liberty. And so we have here what seems like a rather extreme conclusion. The claim is that this marks the downfall of American liberty, the erosion of all our constitutional protections, and it's based on the evidence of the court upholding the right of the police to run sobriety checkpoints. But how do we get from sobriety checkpoints to erosion of all our constitutional protections or to the downfall of American liberty? We go through this series of what seems to be inevitable and also increasingly dangerous attacks on liberty. But of course, there isn't any necessary reason why those consequences would have to follow. It might be perfectly reasonable and within constitutional law for the police to run sobriety checkpoints. There's no necessary reason that all these other things have to follow. And indeed, if one of them started to occur and it seemed like that was a violation of liberty, we could trust, I hope, that the courts would step in and say, even though sobriety checkpoints might be legal, home searches without warrants are not. But the recognition of the possibility of that rational intervention is not recognized here. And so we have what we call the slippery slope fallacy. That is the argument by consequence which is unwarranted. That is, there isn't any reason to believe these consequences would follow from the first step that is acknowledged, that of the right of the police to run sobriety checkpoints. Number 20. Now this comes from a very recent UNH electronic newsletter concerning the Black Lives Matter protests and movement. And in that newsletter story, Associate Professor Vernon Carter suggests that further change must start by acknowledging the power of language. The word rioting often is associated and ascribed to the less powerful in our country, Carter says. Rarely do we see the word rebellion. It was the Watts riots, the Newark riots. Often descriptions of a rebellion are centered around white people. Blacks are said to riot. So in this case, we have a claim by Professor Carter, who says further change must start by acknowledging the power of language. And the evidence he gives is what he says are the tendencies or habits in our language to associate the word rioting with blacks and rebellion with white people, right? He says often descriptions of a rebellion are centered around white people. Blacks are said to riot. So that's the evidence here, but I think it's fair to ask, is that true? That is to say, is it true that in fact riots are associated mainly with black people, and that what white people do when they protest or riot is instead referred to as rebellion? And in fact, I think that's not true. One can look at many examples of rioting in American history. You can go all the way back to the Civil War draft riots in New York, which were mainly Irish Americans or Irish immigrants, almost entirely white people rioting. You can look at the Haymarket riots, the labor riots in Chicago in the late 19th century. Again, mostly white people. Look at the 1968 Democratic Convention riots that took place, the anti-war riots, mostly white students rioting in the streets of Chicago. You can even look at the Vancouver riots after the Boston Bruins defeated the Vancouver Canucks in the Stanley Cup Finals. Again, Vancouver, Canada, mostly white people. Those were referred to as riots. Even the various violent protests or violent celebrations, I guess you would call them, on the UNH campus following different sports championships and the like have been referred to routinely as riots, even though the vast majority of the students involved in them were in fact white people. So I think it's right to question the premise that Professor Carter here asserts as if it is uncontested. And so what I think we have here is a good example of begging the question, where the premise that's advanced, that is the evidence that is put forward, is assumed to be true when in fact It is not at all established by the evidence. In fact, there's a good reason to continue to question the claim that he used, or the statement, the truth of the statement that he uses as the evidence to support this claim. So a begging the question fallacy. Number 21. The red squirrel frequently fights with the gray squirrel over the French fries dropped by students walking from the MUB. For that reason, he's decided to use only black oil sunflower seeds in his bird feeder. So in this case, we have a clue for that reason, right, which tells us that the claim is the second statement here. He's made this decision to use only black oil sunflower seeds, but it's based on evidence that doesn't seem relevant, right? So the evidence is about the observations of the fights between the gray squirrel and the red squirrel over the French fries dropped by students. Well, what does that have to do with deciding what kind of seeds to use in your bird feeder? And in fact, the evidence is irrelevant. It is an example of a non sequitur fallacy. The evidence is not relevant to and so does not support the claim. Number 22. The syllabus states clearly that a student paper will be considered late whenever it is turned in after the end of department business hours on the due date indicated in the syllabus. The student submitted her paper by email attachment at 8:43 p.m., as indicated by the time signature on the message. It follows that since business hours end at 4:30 p.m., the paper was late. A penalty will be assessed. So in this case, we have a claim, which we find by looking at the indicator. It follows that. But we also have this indicator since, so we have additional piece of evidence. So we have the evidence sort of inserted in the middle of the claim here. But it follows that what? It follows that the paper was late. Based on what? Based on, first of all, we have this evidence since business hours end at 4:30, but that gives us the particular principle that's being applied. We also have the facts of the paper being submitted at 8:43 p.m., and all of this only makes sense in reference to the policy, right? So the policy says a paper will be considered late after the end of department business hours on the due date indicated in the syllabus. In other words, we have a clear definition of what counts as a late paper. And so the fact that this student turned in her paper at 8:43, and we know that business hours end at 4:30, this is an argument by definition that leads to the conclusion the paper was late. Number 23. Eventually, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that internment of American citizens of Japanese heritage during World War II was illegal and unconstitutional. The same ruling should apply today to the government's efforts to round up illegal Arab aliens who are in this country without permission. So in this instance, it seems like we're getting a reference to a precedent, that it could be argument by precedent, but of course that's not one of the options here, so we have to look for something else. It is obviously from the similarity category, because we're taking the known case of a court ruling related to the internment of Japanese American citizens, and we're trying to apply that to a new case, the case of the government's efforts to round up illegal Arab aliens. So we have argument by similarity. Of the choices here, we have false analogy and argument by analogy. Is this a reasonable, or in other words, warranted argument by analogy? I think if you look closely, you have to say, no, indeed, it's a false analogy, because how do you test an analogy? An analogy is warranted if the number of similarities is significant and if those similarities are important, right? So we look at both the quality and the quantity of the similarities. And in this case, while there are some similarities, there's also a clearly important difference in the two cases, because in the World War II case, the known case, we were talking about the internment of American citizens of Japanese heritage, right? But in the new case, we're not talking about American citizens, but rather illegal Arab aliens who are in the country without permission. And that difference is a difference that makes a difference. In other words, it's a difference that undermines the credibility of the argument by analogy. It makes it a false analogy fallacy. Number 24. There are only two possible explanations for the video that shows UNH students rioting after the Red Sox loss. It could be authentic evidence of students acting irresponsibly, or it could be a complete fabrication by the UNH police meant to implicate as many students as possible. Since the police have access to this kind of sophisticated technology that would allow such a fabrication, it is clear to me that the evidence is not authentic. So in this case, we have a good clue, two possible explanations, all right? So we're testing one explanation and we're looking at that, and the other explanation, we're looking at that. So when we're thinking about explanations, right, we're thinking about what a thing is. How do we account for what something is? So this is from the being category. And then we look at the different options given for answers here. And there's really only one that deals with explanations, right? And that's the far-fetched hypothesis. So is this, in fact, a far-fetched hypothesis? If you look at the explanation that the arguer says is the one that makes the most sense, that is, it's clear to me the evidence is not authentic, or it's clear to me the police fabricated the evidence, right? And then test that hypothesis. Does it account for all the facts in the case? Well, sure, it would. But is it a simple explanation, and is it the most frequent explanation? So clearly it's not simple. It requires you to believe in a conspiracy on the part of the police to unfairly or unjustly implicate students not involved in a riot. And it also is not the most frequent explanation. That is, most of the time when people are caught on video doing illegal things, it's because they were actually doing illegal things and were caught on video doing it, right? So because of those two tests, we would clearly indicate this is a far-fetched hypothesis. That is, the explanation is not warranted. And then finally, number 25, the study group asked every student in the MUB food court what they thought of the food and the service at Holloway Commons. Only 23% of the students rated Holloway Commons as an excellent or good place to eat. It is clear from these results that most of the students are unhappy with that dining facility. So in this case, we obviously have some kind of an opinion poll, a study group, right, that's asked every student in the MUB food court what they thought. So we have a sample, and we have a target population, right? Most students, not just the students in the study group now, but we have a claim about what most students think. And we have a projected property. And the projected property is 23% of the students rating Holloway Commons excellent or good, which is not a very good rating. So the question is, if we recognize this as a generalization argument, because we're going from the sample to a general claim about what most students believe or think, right? We have a generalization argument. Is it a warranted generalization or not, right? Now I have two choices here. Generalization argument, as it turns out, is not one of the choices, but we do have causal generalization here. So we could ask, is this a causal generalization? But in fact, there is no causal claim that is generalized. So in other words, there's nothing saying here something caused the students to feel a certain way about Holloway Commons, right? So we're not generalizing a causal claim or a connection between a cause and effect. So the only other option that would make sense is a hasty generalization. And indeed, if you test the generalization here, you'll come to the conclusion pretty quickly that the sample is not representative. We don't know how many, it doesn't say, and perhaps there were enough students in the MUB food court to constitute a sample that was big enough, But apart from that, it's obvious that the sample was not randomly selected. Not every UNH student had an equal opportunity to be included in the sample. You had to be in the MUB food court to be in the sample. And then also, we obviously have a biased sample. That is to say, if we just look at the location of the sample, that is, it was done in the MUB food court, so we're already beginning by asking people who have elected to eat somewhere other than Holloway Commons. So they may have an already established bias against Holloway Commons, which is the reason they were found in the food court to begin with. So it's a biased sample. It's also a sample that's not random, and that makes the sample unrepresentative, which leads us to the hasty generalization fallacy. So if you have any questions on this, essentially what is a practice quiz, because it will be very much like your next quiz, if you have any questions about any of the items here or any of the argument forms or fallacies from any of the three categories of interpretation, then post them on the discussion board.